The scream that tore from Josephine Kane's throat disappeared into the howling wind as her stepmother slammed the door, and the iron bolt scraped into place with a finality that sent ice through her veins, colder than the blizzard raging around her. She pounded on the wood until her knuckles split and bled, leaving crimson streaks that froze instantly against the weathered planks. But Margaret Kane had already retreated into the warmth of the house that had once belonged to Josephine's mother, leaving her stepdaughter to face the worst winter storm Pueblo, Colorado had seen in 20 years. It was December 1878, and the wind cut through Josephine's thin cotton nightgown like 1,000 knives. She had been 19 years old for exactly 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks since her father's death from pneumonia, Margaret had made it abundantly clear that Josephine was no longer welcome in the home where she had been born. The argument tonight had started over something trivial, a burned pot of beans, but it had escalated into Margaret's rage spilling over like poison, her face twisted with years of resentment as she shrieked that Josephine had always been in the way, that her father had loved his precious daughter more than his wife, that she would rather freeze to death than spend another night under the same roof as the girl who reminded her daily of her failure to win her husband's complete devotion. Josephine's bare feet were already numb against the snow-covered porch. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying desperately to preserve whatever warmth remained in her body. But the blizzard showed no mercy. The world had become nothing but white, a swirling mass of snow and ice that obscured everything beyond a few feet. She could not see the barn, could not see the road, could not see anything that might offer shelter. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing at her dark hair and whipping it across her face until strands froze against her cheeks. She stumbled down the porch steps, nearly falling as her feet sank into snow that reached past her ankles. The cold was so intense it burned, and she sobbed as she forced herself forward, knowing that staying on the porch meant certain death. Margaret would not relent. Margaret would watch her freeze through the window if she had to. Josephine had seen that look in her stepmother's eyes before, that cold calculation that valued money and property over human life. With Josephine dead, Margaret would inherit everything: the house, the small plot of land, the modest savings Josephine's father had accumulated over his years as a blacksmith. The town was too far to reach on foot in this weather, especially dressed as she was. Josephine tried to orient herself to remember which direction the neighboring homesteads lay, but the blizzard had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world. She walked forward because stopping meant dying, pushed one foot in front of the other even as the feeling left her legs entirely, even as her lungs burned with each breath of frigid air. Her nightgown clung to her body, soaked through with snow, and ice formed in her eyelashes, making it nearly impossible to see. Time lost all meaning. She might have been walking for minutes or hours. Her thoughts began to fragment, memories of her mother flickering through her mind like images in a magic lantern show. She remembered her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, remembered the sound of her laughter, remembered the warmth of the kitchen on baking days when the scent of bread filled the entire house. Her mother had died when Josephine was 12, and her father had remarried 2 years later, bringing Margaret into their lives. Margaret, who had seemed kind at first, but whose true nature had revealed itself gradually, like rot spreading through timber. Josephine's legs gave out. She fell forward into the snow, and for a moment she simply lay there, feeling nothing. The cold had moved beyond pain into a strange, distant numbness. She knew she should get up, knew she should keep moving, but her body would not obey. The wind continued to howl around her, burying her slowly beneath drifts of white. Her last conscious thought was a prayer, formless and desperate, asking whatever God might be listening to let her death be quick. She did not know when she started moving again, did not remember rising to her feet or stumbling forward through the darkness. Later, she would have no memory of those hours, as if her body had operated on instinct alone while her mind retreated somewhere deep inside where the cold could not reach. She walked until she collapsed, rose, and walked again, driven by some animal need to survive that overrode rational thought. When dawn finally broke, gray and reluctant, Josephine found herself lying on wooden planks. A porch. She had somehow found a porch. She could not lift her head to see where she was, could not move her frozen limbs, could barely draw breath. Her skin had turned blue, her lips nearly black, and ice crystals had formed across her exposed skin. She was conscious, barely, but trapped inside a body that had ceased to function. And she lay there as the morning light grew stronger, waiting for the darkness to claim her. Graham Irving had been awake for an hour already, tending to his horses in the barn behind his modest ranch house 5 miles west of Pueblo. The blizzard had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, and he had risen early to ensure his animals had survived the storm unscathed. He was a man of 26 years, tall and broad-shouldered from years of hard work, with dark hair and eyes the color of weathered denim. He had built this ranch with his own hands after returning from a cattle drive to Dodge City 3 years prior, and he took pride in every fence post, every nail, every shingle on the roof. He was walking back to the house, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air, when he saw something on his front porch that made him stop dead in his tracks. At first he thought it was a pile of rags that had blown against his door during the storm, but then he saw the blue-white hand reaching out from beneath what he now recognized as a nightgown, saw the dark hair spread across the boards like spilled ink, and his heart lurched in his chest. Graham ran. He crossed the distance between the barn and the house in seconds, taking the porch steps 2 at a time, and dropped to his knees beside the frozen figure. It was a woman, young, barely more than a girl, and she was dying. Her skin was the color of ice, her breathing so shallow he could barely detect it, and when he touched her neck to check for a pulse, her flesh was rigid and cold beneath his fingers. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and then he was moving, scooping her into his arms, despite the ice that had formed on her nightgown and made it stiff as board. She weighed almost nothing, felt like a frozen bird in his grasp, and he kicked open his door and carried her inside to the warmth of his home. The fire in his hearth had burned low during the night, but coals still glowed red beneath the ash. Graham laid the woman on the rug before the fireplace and immediately began building up the flames, throwing on logs until heat radiated through the room. He had seen frostbite before, had seen men lose fingers and toes and entire limbs to the cold, and he knew that warming her too quickly could be as dangerous as leaving her frozen. But she was so cold, so desperately cold, that he feared any delay might kill her. He stripped away her nightgown with shaking hands, trying to preserve her modesty, but knowing that the frozen fabric had to go. Her skin beneath was mottled purple and white, and he could see no sign that she was breathing. Panic seized him. He grabbed quilts from his bed and wrapped her in them, then pulled her close to his own body, using his warmth to thaw her frozen flesh. He rubbed her arms and legs carefully, trying to restore circulation, and bent close to her face to feel for breath. There, a whisper of air against his cheek. She was alive. Barely, her body still fighting even though all conscious thought had fled. Graham had no medical training beyond what any rancher learned through necessity, but he knew hypothermia when he saw it. He heated water on his stove and used cloths dipped in warm, not hot water to gently thaw her extremities. Her fingers and toes were the color of ash, and he feared she might lose some of them, but he worked methodically, changing the water as it cooled, speaking to her in a low, steady voice even though she gave no sign of hearing him. "You are going to be all right," he told her, hoping it was true. "I have got you. You are safe now." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, sending pale light through his windows. Graham never left her side. He watched the color slowly return to her skin, watched her breathing deepen from those shallow, barely there gasps to something more substantial. Her lips lost some of their blue tinge, becoming pink again, and her eyelids fluttered once, twice, though she did not wake. By midday, she was warm enough that he felt safe leaving her briefly. He went to his kitchen and prepared broth, simple and plain, something her body could manage when she finally regained consciousness. Then he returned to her side and simply watched her. This mysterious woman who had appeared on his porch like something from a ghost story. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had driven her out into a blizzard in nothing but a nightgown? The questions multiplied in his mind, but they could wait. For now, all that mattered was keeping her alive. She opened her eyes as the afternoon sun began to fade. One moment she was unconscious. The next her eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling of an unfamiliar room with confusion written across her features. Graham, who had been dozing in his chair, was instantly alert. "Easy," he said softly, not wanting to frighten her. "You are safe. You are in my home." Her eyes turned toward him, and he saw they were hazel, flecked with gold in the firelight. She tried to speak, but her throat was too raw and only a croak emerged. He reached for a cup of water he had prepared and helped her drink, supporting her head with one hand while holding the cup to her lips with the other. She drank greedily, then gasped and fell back against the pillows he had arranged beneath her. "Where?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Where am I?" "About 5 miles west of Pueblo," Graham said. "I found you on my porch at dawn. You were frozen near to death." He paused, studying her face. "What is your name?" "Josephine," she whispered. "Josephine Kane." "I am Graham Irving. This is my ranch." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Josephine, what happened to you? How did you end up out in that blizzard?" The question seemed to crack something inside her. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks, and her face crumpled with grief and exhaustion. "My stepmother," she said, the words breaking on a sob. "She locked me out. She told me she wanted me to die." The blunt horror of it struck Graham like a physical blow. "She locked you out? In last night's storm?" Josephine nodded, unable to speak past the tears that now came in earnest. Graham felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and fierce. What kind of monster locked a girl out in a blizzard? What kind of cruelty was that? He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the floor, and without thinking about propriety or convention, he gathered her into his arms and let her weep against his chest. She cried like something broken, great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body, and he held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair while he murmured soothing nonsense. When the storm of grief finally passed, she pulled back, looking embarrassed. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her eyes. "You must think me a fool." "I think you survived something no one should have to endure," Graham said firmly, "and I think you are one of the strongest people I have ever met." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Strong? I nearly died. But you did not?" He caught her gaze and held it. "You walked through that blizzard. Your body was frozen solid, but you found my porch. You survived when most people would have given up and let the cold take them. That is strength, Josephine Kane." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of warmth in eyes that had been hollow with despair. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for saving me. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said softly, "not anyone." Over the next several days, Josephine slowly recovered her strength. Graham insisted she stay in his bed while he slept on the floor by the fire, despite her protests that she had already imposed enough. She lost 2 toes on her left foot and the tip of one finger to frostbite, but Graham tended to her wounds with a gentleness that surprised them both, changing bandages and applying salve while carefully not looking at anything he should not. They talked during those long winter days while snow continued to fall outside and the world remained white and frozen. Josephine told him about her father, the blacksmith, who had raised her with love and kindness, teaching her to read and write and cipher numbers. She told him about her mother, dead these 7 years, and about Margaret, the woman her father had married in a moment of loneliness that he had regretted until his dying day. He knew she did not love him, Josephine said one evening as they sat before the fire. She in Graham's chair with her damaged foot propped on cushions, he on the floor leaning against the hearth. But I think he hoped she might grow to care for him. She never did. She only wanted security, a home, someone to provide for her. And when he died, she had no more use for you, Graham said, his voice hard. No use and no love. Josephine stared into the flames. I thought she would tolerate me at least. I thought we could live together, divide the work between us, but she hated me. I saw it in her eyes every day. She blamed me for taking her husband's attention, for being in the way. She is evil, Graham said flatly. To do what she did, that is evil. Josephine could not argue with that. Graham told her his own story in turn. He had come west from Missouri 5 years ago with dreams of making his fortune in the gold fields, but he had quickly discovered that ranching suited him better than mining. He had worked as a cowboy for 3 years, learning the trade and saving every penny, before buying this land and building his ranch. He was alone out here. No wife, no children, just himself and his horses, and his dreams of building something that would last. Do you ever get lonely? Josephine asked one night. Graham considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, but loneliness is better than bad company. He glanced at her. Though I have to say, the company these past few days has been more than tolerable. She smiled, a real smile that lit up her face and made Graham's heart do something complicated in his chest. He had been trying not to notice how beautiful she was, trying not to think about the way firelight caught in her hair or the curve of her mouth when she laughed, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. She was his guest, a woman he had saved from death, and any improper thoughts seemed like a betrayal of the trust she had placed in him. But the thoughts came anyway, unbidden and insistent. A week after he found her, the weather finally cleared enough for Graham to ride into Pueblo. He went alone, leaving Josephine at the ranch with strict instructions to rest and keep her injured foot elevated. He needed supplies, he told her, and besides, it would do good to let folks in town know she was alive and safe. The ride into Pueblo took 2 hours through snow-drifted trails. Graham had lived in this area long enough to know most of the local families by name, and he headed directly to the sheriff's office when he arrived. Sheriff Daniel Holt was a man in his 50s, gruff but fair, who had maintained order in Pueblo for nearly a decade. Graham told him everything, about finding Josephine frozen on his porch, about her stepmother locking her out in the blizzard, about the near death and the slow recovery. The sheriff listened with a deepening scowl, and when Graham finished, Holt slammed his fist on the desk hard enough to make papers jump. Margaret Kane, he spat. I never liked that woman. Always something cold about her. He stood up and reached for his coat. I will ride out to the Kane place and have a talk with her. What she did is attempted murder, no two ways about it. Good, Graham said, because if I go out there, I'm not sure I could keep my temper. The sheriff gave him a knowing look. You taking a shine to the girl? Graham felt heat rise in his face. She is a good woman who has been through hell. I just want to see justice done. Sure, Holt said, clearly not believing him. Well, you tell Miss Kane that she does not need to worry. I will make certain Margaret understands that if anything happens to Josephine, anything at all, I will know exactly where to look. Graham thanked him and left the office feeling somewhat lighter. He purchased supplies at the general store, flour and coffee and dried beans, and was loading them onto his horse when a woman's voice called his name. He turned to find Sarah Mitchell approaching, the banker's daughter who had made it abundantly clear on several occasions that she would welcome Graham's attention. She was pretty in a conventional way, blonde and blue-eyed, But Graham had never felt any spark of interest. Now she smiled at him with all her teeth showing, like a cat that had spotted cream. "Graham Irving," she said, batting her eyelashes in a way she probably thought was charming. "I have not seen you in town for weeks." "Been busy at the ranch," Graham said neutrally, trying to be polite. "How are you, Miss Mitchell?" "Oh, just wonderful. Papa says business is excellent." She moved closer, her hand coming to rest on his arm. "I was thinking perhaps you might call on me sometime. Mama makes the most wonderful Sunday dinners, and we would be delighted to have you." Graham gently removed his arm from her grasp. "That is kind of you, but I will have to decline. I have a guest at my ranch who requires care." Sarah's eyes sharpened with curiosity. "A guest? Who?" "A friend who was caught in the blizzard," Graham said vaguely. "Now, if you will excuse me, I need to get back." He mounted his horse and rode away before she could ask more questions, but he could feel her eyes boring into his back the entire way down Main Street. Town gossip was vicious and fast spreading, and he had no doubt that by tomorrow everyone in Pueblo would know he had a woman staying at his ranch. Let them talk. He did not care what they thought. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever. Graham found himself urging his horse faster, eager to return, and it was not until he crested the final hill and saw his house in the valley below that he admitted to himself why he was hurrying. Josephine was there, waiting for him, and the thought of seeing her again filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun. She was standing at the window when he arrived, watching for him, and her face broke into a smile of genuine relief when she saw him. Graham dismounted and carried his supplies inside, and Josephine immediately began fussing over him, helping him put things away and heating water for coffee. "You should not be on that foot," Graham scolded gently, but he was smiling as he said it. "I have been sitting all day," Josephine countered. "I needed to move." She poured coffee for both of them and sat across from him at the table. "Did you see the sheriff?" Graham told her everything about Holt's promise to confront Margaret, about the charges that might be brought, about the assurance that she would be protected. Josephine listened in silence, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and when he finished, she let out a long breath. "I do not want her arrested," she said quietly. Graham stared at her in disbelief. "She tried to murder you." "I know." Josephine's voice was steady despite the pain in her eyes. "But she is still the woman my father married. He loved her once, or thought he did. I do not want to dishonor his memory by sending his widow to prison. Josephine, she does not deserve your mercy. Maybe not, but I deserve my peace." She looked up at him, and her gaze was clear and resolved. "I want to let her go. I want to move forward with my life and never look back at her again. Dragging this through the courts, testifying, reliving it all, that would keep me tied to her. I want to be free." Graham understood even if he did not agree. "The house is yours by rights," he said. "Your father left it to you." "Let her have it." Josephine's voice was firm. "Let her have all of it, the house, the land, everything. I do not want it. Every board, every nail, it would all remind me of what she did." "Then what will you do?" Graham asked quietly. "Graham." Josephine met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, a question and an answer all at once. "I do not know," she said softly, "but I think I will figure it out." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Graham went about his daily work, tending to his horses and repairing fences and chopping wood for the fire, while Josephine gradually took over the running of his household. She cooked and cleaned and mended his clothes, and Graham came in each evening to find hot meals waiting and the house filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. They talked endlessly about everything and nothing. Graham told her about his years on the cattle drives, the dust and heat and danger, the camaraderie among the cowboys, the satisfaction of delivering a herd successfully after months on the trail. Josephine told him about growing up in Pueblo, about sneaking books from the lending library and reading by candlelight after her stepmother had gone to bed, about her dreams of one day seeing the ocean even though she had never been further than Denver. I will take you there, Graham said one night without thinking, and then froze, realizing what he had implied. Josephine looked at him with those hazel eyes, and a slow smile spread across her face. Will you? If you want me to, he said, his heart hammering against his ribs. If you would like to see the ocean, I will take you there. I would like that, Josephine said softly, and the promise hung in the air between them, full of possibility. It was Graham who first acknowledged what was growing between them. It was a cold February evening, nearly 2 months since he had found her on his porch, and they were sitting before the fire as had become their habit. Josephine was darning one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight, and Graham was pretending to read a week-old newspaper but actually watching her over the top of the pages. Josephine, he said suddenly, setting aside the paper. She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Yes? I need to tell you something. He took a breath, gathering his courage. These past weeks having you here, it has been the best time of my life. I wake up happy and go to bed happy, and it is because of you. You make this house feel like a home in a way it never has before. Josephine set down her sewing, her expression careful. Graham. I know I have no right to say this, he continued, the words tumbling out now that he had started. You have been through something terrible, and you are still recovering. And the last thing you probably want is some cowboy making a fool of himself over you, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore. I have feelings for you, Josephine, strong feelings, and if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I would like to know. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Josephine stared at him, her eyes wide, and Graham felt his heart sinking. He had misread everything, had projected his own feelings onto innocent kindness, and now he had ruined everything by opening his mouth. Then Josephine smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. You're not making a fool of yourself, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I feel the same way. I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything. I am living in your home, eating your food, relying on your charity. I did not want you to think I was trying to trap you into something out of gratitude. Trap me? Graham stood up and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. Josephine, I would consider it the greatest privilege of my life if you chose to stay, not out of necessity or gratitude, but because you wanted to, because you cared for me the way I care for you. She reached out and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle. I do care for you. More than I thought it was possible to care about someone. When you ride out each morning, I count the hours until you come back. When you smile at me, my heart does foolish things. When you are near me, I feel safe in a way I have not felt since my mother died. Graham turned his head and kissed her palm, then leaned forward and touched his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, tentative at first, then deepening as Josephine responded, her fingers sliding into his hair. Graham wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close, and they kissed by the firelight while outside the winter wind howled and snow continued to fall. But inside they were warm and safe and together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Graham rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he whispered. I know it is fast, and maybe I am crazy for asking, but marry me, Josephine. Stay here with me. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy. Tears slid down Josephine's cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes, she said, yes, I will marry you. They were wed in early March, as soon as the roads cleared enough to ride into Pueblo. The ceremony was small and simple, held in the town's only church with Sheriff Holt and his wife standing as witnesses. Josephine wore a dress of deep blue that Graham had purchased for her, and Graham wore his Sunday best, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. Josephine's stepmother did not attend. Margaret Kane had left Pueblo in late January, selling the house and property for whatever she could get and disappearing westward toward California. Sheriff Holt had questioned her about the night of the blizzard, and Margaret had claimed it was all a misunderstanding. that Josephine had run away on her own, but no one believed her. The stain of what she had done followed her, and she had fled rather than face the consequences. Josephine felt nothing when she heard Margaret was gone. No relief, no satisfaction, nothing. It was as if a chapter of her life had closed completely, leaving no residue behind. She was Mrs. Graham Irving, now starting fresh with a man who loved her and whom she loved in return, and the past could stay buried in the snow. Their wedding night was tender and nervous and perfect. Graham was patient and gentle, mindful of Josephine's inexperience, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath quilts, Josephine's head on Graham's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Are you happy?" Graham asked softly. "Happier than I have ever been," Josephine replied, and it was the absolute truth. Spring came to Colorado in a rush of melting snow and budding trees. Graham and Josephine settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked side by side, Josephine proving herself as capable with horses as she was with household tasks. Graham discovering that he loved having a partner who shared both his work and his dreams. They talked about expanding the ranch, about buying more horses to breed and sell, about perhaps growing hay to supply the cavalry fort that had been established 20 miles to the south. Josephine proved to have a head for numbers, and she began keeping careful accounts of their expenses and income, finding ways to stretch their money further. By summer, the ranch was thriving. Graham had acquired a breeding pair of fine horses from a rancher in Denver, and Josephine had planted a garden that yielded vegetables in abundance. They sold their surplus at the market in Pueblo, and slowly their savings began to grow. But more than the material success, it was the life they built together that mattered. They rose early and worked hard, but they also made time for each other. On Sunday afternoons, they would saddle horses and ride into the mountains, exploring trails and swimming in cold streams, laughing like children, and making love in hidden meadows where no one could see. Josephine bloomed under Graham's devotion. The haunted look that had lurked in her eyes for months finally faded, replaced by confidence and joy. She was no longer the frozen girl on the porch, no longer the victim of cruelty. She was a rancher's wife, a woman building a life on her own terms, and she was happy. In late August, Josephine began to suspect she was pregnant. She said nothing to Graham at first, not wanting to get his hopes up if she was wrong. But when 2 months had passed and her monthly courses had not come, she knew. She waited for the right moment to tell him, planning how she would say it. But in the end, the words just spilled out one evening as they were washing dishes after supper. "I am going to have a baby," she said, her hands stilling in the soapy water. Graham, who had been drying a plate, nearly dropped it. "What?" "A baby. I am pregnant." She turned to face him, suddenly nervous. They had never explicitly discussed children, had never talked about whether they wanted them or when. What if he was not ready? But the expression on Graham's face erased all her doubts. He set down the dish and the towel and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed and held onto his shoulders. "A baby," he kept repeating, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Josephine said. And then she was crying, happy tears that soaked into Graham's shirt as he held her close and kissed her hair and whispered promises about the future. Their son was born the following April, a squalling, healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. They named him Thomas, after Josephine's father, and Graham wept when she told him the name she had chosen, understanding the honor she was bestowing. Josephine took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. She nursed Thomas and sang to him and spent hours simply watching him sleep, marveling that this perfect tiny human had come from her body. Graham was an attentive father, coming in from work multiple times a day to check on his wife and son, and on nights when Thomas was fussy, he would walk the floor with the baby cradled against his chest, humming old cowboy songs until the infant settled. The months after Thomas's birth were exhausting and wonderful. Sleep became a luxury. Their carefully maintained routine fell apart, and the house was perpetually scattered with diapers and baby clothes, but every hardship was offset by moments of pure joy. Thomas's first smile, his first laugh, the way he would reach for Graham when he came through the door. By the time Thomas was a year old, Josephine was pregnant again, and this time they greeted the news with the calm of experience rather than first-time wonder. Their daughter Anna was born in January of 1881, a placid baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world with serious gray eyes. The ranch continued to grow along with their family. Graham hired a young man named Peter to help with the horses, and Josephine's garden expanded until they were supplying vegetables to half the families in Pueblo. They built an addition onto the house, adding 2 bedrooms and a proper parlor, transforming the modest cabin into a real home. Life was not without its challenges. There were droughts and illnesses, horses that went lame, and crops that failed. In the summer of 1882, a rattlesnake bit Graham while he was mending fence, and Josephine had to ride like fury into Pueblo to fetch the doctor, leaving the children with their hired hand while she prayed her husband would survive. He did, though he was sick for weeks, and Josephine never left his side during the worst of it, bathing his fevered skin and forcing water down his throat when he was too delirious to drink on his own. "You saved me," Graham said when he was finally lucid again, his voice weak, but his eyes clear. "You saved me first," Josephine replied, taking his hand in hers. "I am just returning the favor." As the years passed, their love deepened and matured. They knew each other completely, understood each other's moods and rhythms, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room. They argued sometimes because they were both stubborn and passionate, but they always made up before going to bed, unwilling to let anger fester. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and handle horses with a natural skill that made Graham swell with pride. Anna was quieter, more bookish, content to sit with her mother and learn to read and write and do sums. When she was 5, Josephine began teaching her everything her own father had taught her, and Anna soaked it all up like parched earth drinking rain. In 1885, when Thomas was 6 and Anna 4, Josephine gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named David and Samuel. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, leaving Josephine weak and bedridden for weeks. Graham was beside himself with worry, but Josephine was made of stern stuff, and she recovered slowly, regaining her strength through sheer determination. "No more," the doctor told them sternly after the twins were born. "Mrs. Irving, another pregnancy could kill you." Graham looked at Josephine, and she looked back at him, and they both knew without speaking that their family was complete. They had 4 healthy children, a thriving ranch, and each other. It was more than enough. The children grew, and the ranch prospered. By 1890, Graham and Josephine had become fixtures in the Pueblo community, respected and well-liked. They attended church on Sundays, participated in town events, and their home was always open to neighbors in need. Josephine never forgot what it felt like to be cast out, to face death alone in the cold, and she made sure that no one who came to her door was ever turned away hungry. They never spoke about Margaret Kane. She had disappeared into California, and if she lived or died, they never knew. Josephine had meant what she said about letting go, and she kept that promise. The woman who had tried to kill her was less than a ghost, merely a bad memory that grew fainter with each passing year until she had no power at all. Instead, Josephine focused on building something better. She taught her children about kindness and hard work and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. She and Graham expanded the ranch until they were running 50 horses and supplying remounts to the Army. They hired more hands, built a bigger barn, and became one of the most successful operations in the region. But more than the material success, what mattered was the life they had built. Their home was filled with laughter and love, with the sound of children playing and horses nickering in the pasture and the smell of bread baking in the oven. On winter evenings, the family would gather around the fire, Graham telling stories while Josephine mended clothes, and the children listened with wide eyes, and those moments felt sacred, proof that happiness was possible even after darkness. As the new century approached, Graham and Josephine found themselves looking back on their lives with satisfaction and forward to the future with hope. Their oldest, Thomas, was 17 now, a young man who had already announced his intention to take over the ranch someday. Anna was 15, beautiful and brilliant, with plans to become a teacher. The twins were 11, wild and energetic, and constantly getting into mischief but fundamentally good-hearted. One evening in late December of 1899, with a light snow falling outside and the house warm and bright, Graham and Josephine sat together on the porch swing he had built for her birthday years before. The children were inside, arguing over a board game, their voices drifting through the open window. "Do you remember the first time you saw this porch?" Graham asked, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "I was frozen solid," Josephine said with a slight smile. "I do not remember much of anything from that morning." 21 years ago," Graham marveled. 21 years since I found you here, more dead than alive." 21 years since you saved my life." Josephine turned to look at him, and her eyes were soft. "Everything I have, everything I am, it is because of you." "No," Graham said firmly. "You saved yourself, Josephine. You walked through that blizzard when anyone else would have given up. You survived. I just gave you a place to heal." "You gave me everything," Josephine insisted. "A home, a family, a life worth living. You gave me love when I thought I would never trust anyone again. You gave me happiness I did not know existed." Graham pulled her closer, kissing her temple. "We gave those things to each other." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall and listening to their children inside. The ranch spread out before them, fence lines and pastures and barns, all of it built with their own hands and nurtured with their own sweat. This was their legacy, not just the land and buildings, but the family they had created, the love they had cultivated, the life they had chosen together. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had been different?" Josephine asked quietly. "If Margaret had not locked me out that night? If I had not found your porch?" "Every day," Graham admitted. "And every day I thank God that things happened exactly as they did, because they led me to you." "They led us to each other," Josephine corrected, and she leaned up to kiss him, her lips warm against his despite the cold evening air. Inside, one of the twins yelled that the other was cheating, and Anna's voice rose above the squabble, trying to restore order. Thomas laughed at something, the sound deep and adult, and Josephine smiled against Graham's mouth. "We should go inside," she murmured, "before they destroy the house." "In a minute." Graham tightened his arms around her, not ready to let go of this moment. "Let me hold you just a little longer." So they stayed on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, while snow fell around them, and inside their home their children filled the rooms with noise and life and joy. The blizzard that had nearly killed Josephine 21 years ago had brought her to this porch, to this man, to this life she had built from frozen ashes. She had been locked out in the cold and left to die, but she had survived, had found warmth and love, and a future beyond anything she could have imagined. As they finally rose and went inside to join their family, Josephine paused at the threshold and looked back at the porch one last time. This was where her new life had begun, where death had been transformed into possibility. She would never forget that morning, would carry it with her always, but now it was just one piece of a much larger story, a story that continued to unfold with each passing day. Graham took her hand, his fingers warm and solid, and together they crossed into the warmth of their home, closing the door behind them on the winter night. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations and the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas married at 22, bringing home a sweet-natured girl named Elizabeth from Denver, and they gave Graham and Josephine their first grandchild, a girl named Rose, in 1905. Anna became a teacher as she had always planned, taking a position at the Pueblo schoolhouse and earning a reputation for her patience and innovative teaching methods. The twins, inseparable as always, went into business together, buying a string of horses and starting their own breeding operation on land adjacent to the family ranch. Graham and Josephine grew older together, their dark hair silvering, their faces lining with age, but their love remained as strong as ever. They had weathered every storm together, both literal and metaphorical, and each challenge had only made them stronger. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Graham surprised Josephine with a trip to California, fulfilling his long-ago promise to take her to see the ocean. They stood on the beach at San Francisco hand in hand, watching the waves roll in beneath a vast blue sky. Josephine waded into the surf, laughing as the cold water soaked her skirts, and Graham joined her, and they embraced in the shallows like young lovers despite the gray in their hair. "Was it worth the wait?" Graham asked, his arms around her waist. "Everything with you is worth waiting for," Josephine replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They returned to Colorado renewed, ready to face whatever the future held. And the future, as it turned out, held more joy than sorrow. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with young voices and laughter. Thomas proved to be as capable a rancher as his father, expanding the operation and introducing new breeding techniques. Anna married late at 35, choosing a widowed doctor who adored her and adopted her love of books. The twins remained bachelors, married to their horses in the open range, content with their lot. As the 1910s arrived, Graham and Josephine began to slow down. They were in their 50s now, still healthy but no longer young, and they gradually turned over the running of the ranch to Thomas and his family. It was not retirement exactly, but a shifting of responsibilities, an acknowledgement that the next generation was ready to lead. They spent more time together now, just the two of them, walking the property in the early morning or sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the mountains. They talked about everything and nothing, reminisced about the early days, and marveled at how far they had come. "I love you," Graham would say, out of nowhere, in the middle of an ordinary moment. "I love you too," Josephine would reply every single time, and the words never grew stale or lost their meaning. In the summer of 1918, Pueblo organized a celebration for the town's 50th anniversary, and Graham and Josephine were invited to speak as pioneer settlers. They stood before a crowd of hundreds telling their story, and people listened with rapt attention. Josephine spoke about the night of the blizzard, her voice steady as she described the cold and the fear and the certainty that she was going to die. Graham spoke about finding her on his porch, about the miracle of her survival, about the life they had built together from that frozen beginning. When they finished, the crowd erupted in applause, and several women were openly weeping. Later, people approached them to shake their hands and thank them for sharing such an inspiring story. A young couple, newly married, asked Graham what the secret was to a long and happy marriage. Graham looked at Josephine, and she looked back at him, and they smiled. "Choose each other," Graham said simply. "Every single day, no matter what happens, choose each other." "And do not take a single moment for granted," Josephine added. "Life is precious and fragile. Love while you can, as deeply as you can, because tomorrow is never guaranteed." The young couple nodded solemnly, absorbing the wisdom, and Graham and Josephine walked away hand in hand, content in the knowledge that they had lived those words, had built a life on that foundation. As the 1920s dawned, bringing jazz music and automobiles in a changing world, Graham and Josephine remained anchored in the life they had created. The ranch was still thriving under Thomas's management, now one of the premier horse breeding operations in Colorado. Their grandchildren were growing up strong and healthy, learning the values their grandparents had instilled in their parents. Graham's health began to fail in 1924. He developed a cough that would not go away, and despite the doctor's best efforts, it worsened over the winter. By spring, he was confined to bed more often than not. His breathing labored, his strength fading. Josephine nursed him with the same fierce devotion she had brought to everything else in her life, refusing to give up hope even when the doctor told her gently that there was nothing more to be done. On a warm afternoon in June, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and the sound of horses in the pasture outside, Graham called Josephine to his side. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding his hand, and he smiled at her with eyes that still held all the love he had felt on the day they married. "Do you remember the day I found you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every detail," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my life that day." "No," Graham said, "you saved mine. Everything good in my life came from you. Our children, this ranch, every moment of happiness I have ever known, it all started the morning I opened my door and found you there. You were the greatest gift I ever received, Josephine." "And you were mine," she whispered, bending to kiss his forehead. "I love you so much, Graham. I always have. I always will." "I know," he said, and his smile widened. "I am the luckiest man who ever lived." He died with her hand in his peacefully, with their family gathered around and the afternoon sun warm on his face. Josephine held him for a long time after he was gone, unwilling to let go, unable to imagine a world without him in it. The funeral was the largest Pueblo had ever seen. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects to Graham Irving, the cowboy who had built a life from nothing and lived it with integrity and kindness. They told stories about him, about his generosity and his work ethic and his devotion to his family, and Josephine listened to it all through a haze of grief, grateful that so many people had recognized the goodness in the man she loved. The months after Graham's death were the hardest of Josephine's life, harder even than the night in the blizzard, because this time there was no hope of rescue, no warming by the fire, no miraculous recovery. Graham was gone, and she would never see him again in this life. She woke each morning to emptiness, went through the motions of living because her children needed her to, but inside she felt hollow, a shell of the woman she had been. It was Anna who finally pulled her back from the edge of despair. Her daughter came to visit one afternoon bringing Rose's baby, Josephine's great-grandson, and placed the child in Josephine's arms. "He needs his great-grandmother," Anna said firmly. "We all need you, Mama. Papa would not want you to give up." Josephine looked down at the baby, at his tiny, perfect face and curious eyes, and something shifted inside her. Graham was gone, but his legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The life they had built together continued, growing and branching like a tree, and she owed it to his memory to keep going, to keep nurturing what they had created. So she did. Josephine lived for 13 more years after Graham's death, years filled with family and purpose. She helped raise grandchildren and great-grandchildren, taught them to read and write and think for themselves. She worked in her garden and rode horses when her health allowed, and told stories about their grandfather to children who had never known him, but learned to love him through her words. She never remarried, never even considered it. Graham had been the love of her life, and she remained faithful to his memory until her own end. But she was not bitter or sad. She had lived a full and beautiful life, had known love in its deepest form, and she was grateful for every moment. Josephine Irving died in her sleep on a cold December night in 1937 at the age of 78. Her children found her in the morning, peaceful in her bed, a slight smile on her face. On the table beside her was a photograph from their wedding day. Graham young and handsome in his Sunday best, Josephine radiant in blue, both of them looking at the camera with joy and hope shining in their eyes. They buried her next to Graham in the Pueblo cemetery, beneath a cottonwood tree that shed golden leaves in autumn. The entire town turned out for the funeral, paying tribute to a woman who had survived death and built a life of such richness and meaning that had inspired everyone who knew her. At the graveside, Thomas spoke about his parents' love story, about the blizzard and the frozen porch and the cowboy who had saved a dying girl and ended up finding his soulmate. "They showed us what love looks like," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Not just romance, but partnership and devotion and choosing each other every single day for almost 50 years. They built this family, this legacy from nothing but determination and love, and we are all better for having known them." The family gathered at the ranch after the funeral, filling the house with warmth and voices just as Graham and Josephine had always wanted. Their great-grandchildren played in the same rooms where their own children had grown up, ran through the same pastures, looked out at the same mountains. The ranch continued to thrive, fourth generation now preparing to take the reins, and every person there understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a story that had begun on a frozen porch 60 years before. That night, after everyone had gone home, Thomas walked out to the porch where his father had found his mother all those years ago. He stood there in the cold December air, looking up at the stars, and he could almost feel them there, his parents, watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to their memory, to whatever gods might be listening. "Thank you for showing us how to live, how to love, how to build something that lasts." The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a horse nickered softly. The ranch slept under a blanket of stars, safe and warm and full of love, just as Graham and Josephine had dreamed it would be. Their story had ended, but their legacy would go on forever, carried forward by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had learned from their example. They had started with nothing, a frozen girl on a porch and a cowboy with a kind heart, and they had built a dynasty of love that would endure long after both of them were gone. And that, more than anything else, was the happy ending they had always deserved.